I'm a physiotherapist by profession, and I've always been interested in certainly throwing and the upper limb as a physio. When I came to work for England Cricket from Australia 13 years ago, I was treating a lot of throwing related arm pain at the shoulder and elbow. And there was a big assumption there at the time in England Cricket that, oh, well, baseball's got this all figured out. We just do what baseball does. And I was like, well, we can't assume that a cricketer is the same as a baseballer, and actually has baseball got it all figured out. So that kind of started me on a research journey, which led to a PhD. I've had the studies on my PhD done for quite a while, but just in the process of writing it up. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk to you today is about what we kind of learned through the PhD on these adaptations. I think the first thing that we need to define is actually what is a throwing athlete. And when you look at the literature, a lot of people will talk about overhead sports and they'll lump throwing sports in with other overhead sports such as swimming. But they're very, very different in the demands on the upper limb. And so throwing sports for me are what I would call unilateral overhead sports. So they're unilateral, so one side's dominant, whereas in your bilateral overhead sports like swimming or your paddling sports like canoeing, both upper limbs are being used. In unilateral overhead sports, it's asynchronous. So what I mean by that is that the limbs work in an asynchronous manner, whereas in swimming and paddling, there's this synchronicity of how the upper limbs work. Throwing sports are intermittent, so you'll do a throw and then you'll have a rest period, and again, that will vary depending on the sport. Whereas in swimming or paddling, there's this continuous motion of the upper limb. Unilateral overhead sports have similar phases, and we'll talk a bit about them later on. And they have very high levels of eccentric stress, particularly in the deceleration phases, but also in the late cocking phases. Whereas in your sports like swimming in particular and paddling, the actual eccentric stress is relatively low. So they're quite different in the biomechanics, and as a result, you get very different adaptations and to these different sports. I would classify all these sports as throwing sports because they all share these same characteristics. Now, the implement is different, so the size of a water polo ball versus a handball versus a baseball versus a javelin is different. Some of them are hitting sports, so spiking a volleyball, an overhead smash in badminton or serve in tennis. But actually what happens at the shoulder in these actions is quite similar, even though there are obviously differences in the implement and the base of support and whether it's a closed or open skill. Throwing athletes, there's a similar general motor pattern at the shoulder. There are similar musculoskeletal adaptations, or there are some differences between sports, and that's what I'm going to talk a lot about today. They do get similar upper limb injuries at the shoulder and elbow, which I'm not going to talk about today. But as I said, there are these differences between them which make them unique. When we talk about the phases of throwing, most of the biomechanics work has been done in baseball pitching. Very little has been done in cricket throwing. There's been some work done in handball and American football and quarterbacks. And as I said, there's this similar general pattern, and even the same thing in surfing. But the three phases which are common are the ones that I've highlighted, which are cocking phase, acceleration, and deceleration phase. And it's these phases which is where we get these kind of common adaptations. So again, this is a baseball model. There are going to be differences in other sports, but essentially the cocking phase ends in maximum external rotation. So it's that slide there on the right. And if we look at that baseball picture, they're probably at about 160 to 170 degrees of external rotation. And certainly when I was in physiotherapy school, we got told that the normal ranges of motion of the shoulder were about 100 degrees maximum. So that's significantly greater than what is considered, normal. So the cocking phase, as I said, it ends in maximum external rotation. And this is critical for velocity. And the analogy that I use with my cricket coaches is, if you're pulling a bow and an arrow, the further you can cock back, the more tension you can develop, the more time you've got to develop speed going forward. So it's really critical for velocity. I've got a photo, I think later, the first photo of a cricketer called Brett Lee. He's probably at about 200 degrees of external rotation, which is just massive. It doesn't all happen at the shoulder. So some of it is that external rotation at the shoulder, but you do get some changes in scapular position, changes in the thoracic spine into extension rotation, and a bit of valgus stress at the elbow. So that's where you get into that position. And at that very end range position, there's a fair degree of eccentric stress in the shoulder internal rotators, basically stopping the hand from over rotating back forwards before it can then come forwards into accelerate. Yeah.
Is there also a high degree of eccentric stress in the thoracic rotators, or not as much?
No, not much really.
Okay.
You would get, so in this position, the thoracic spine has started to rotate towards the target. So your abdominal sling, so your internal, so if you're a right-handed thrower, your external oblique on your right side and your internal oblique on your left side, that sling, are starting to rotate that forwards. Okay. So the trunk rotates, and then the weight of the arm gets dragged behind it. There's that lag. Does that kind of make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
So in this phase anyway, that anterior abdominal sling is actually probably working concentrically to rotate the trunk forwards. So the next one is acceleration phase. Now in throwing sports, this is where the shoulder starts to internally rotate until the ball is released. In your hitting sports, it's when the shoulder starts to internally rotate until it either hits the object in a tennis serve or a smash. So this is the fastest recorded joint motion in all of sports. And so in some baseball pitches, the fastest ones, they've recorded up to 7,000 revolutions per minute. So that's massive, basically. So if you divide that by 360, you're looking at 18 complete revolutions of the shoulder going around. Elbow extension is also rapid, and what you get is you get this brief concentric activity of your shoulder internal rotators to get that arm moving forwards to accelerate the hand and accelerate the ball. And what we know from a number of studies and the studies that we did in cricket is that shoulder internal rotation strength is highly correlated with throwing velocity. And that's in a number of sports. That's in handball, that's in baseball, that's in water polo, and that's in cricket. So the deceleration phase is basically we've either let go of the ball or we've hit the object, and it stops when our shoulder reaches maximum internal rotation. And this is the applying the brakes. So we've generated all this force to throw the ball, throw the implement, hit the ball. Now we've got to slow that force down quickly. Now, particularly at the shoulder, our shoulder external rotators are working eccentrically to slow the shoulder down. Our long-headed biceps is working to stop the ball effectively being thrown out of its socket. I think, however, what's critical to know is that it's not just what's happening at the shoulder, it's a whole body activity. So you've got trunk flexion, hip flexion, trunk rotation. The whole body is working to kind of slow the arm down and dissipate those forces. So that's a bit of, how I see throwing sports and the common themes. As I said, there are obviously different things. Again, if anyone's worked, with a throwing athlete, they look different. Their muscle bulk on their throwing side is significantly greater. Their shoulder sits in a different position. They certainly don't look symmetrical. And again, there's a lot of discussion around, well, what actually is normal for a thrower? And this is where we're talking about these, adaptations to throwing. With throwers, we've got this kind of inbuilt comparison. We can look at their throwing side, which is the dominant side, to their non-dominant side. And we can say that any differences that we have on the throwing side are likely to be those which have been acquired from this throwing activity. So that's how we do this comparison. We compare side to side. These changes mainly happen in the upper limb, although there's some changes that happen in the lower limb as well, although not as consistent, which I'm not going to talk about today. They occur at a young age, and as we go through each of the different adaptations that you get to throwing, I'll talk about when they appear, certainly in the research. What we also have to consider, is this a chicken or an egg phenomenon? So what I mean is, do throwers look this way because they've done a lot of throwing activity, or because they had these natural side-to-side differences, did that give them a performance advantage, which then made them be a better thrower at a young age? And then because they got pushed into that sport, they were kind of self-selected. And again, that's a question that us as researchers are very hard to answer, which I can talk about if you're interested in. And then the other thing that we have to consider with these side-to-side differences is, do they relate to performance or do they relate to injury risk? Because again, as coaches, what you want to know is, how do I get better? And so how do I stay healthy so I can compete? And as a physiotherapist working, in elite sport, our job is to not only just try to keep them healthy on the park, but we've got to, make them be able to perform as well, because there's no point being healthy if you actually can't perform. So there's this concept of adaptations, which are helpful for performance. So these are the changes which actually help you perform better, and maladaptations. So these are unhelpful for the organism, and in this case, they're associated with injury. And as we go through the different changes that we see, we're going to talk about, are they adaptations, so helpful for performance, or unhelpful? The reality is there's probably a kind of a Goldilocks zone where you probably need to have been adapted to your sport to perform well. But if you adapt too much and your body's too different, then you probably put yourself at risk. And again, we can talk about that phenomenon as well. What we're going to do now is, this is one of the studies from my PhD where we compared side to side, so throwing side and non-throwing side in the upper limb in high-level cricketers. So we had 83 senior professional cricketers and a number of international players, and 79 adolescent international cricketers. Now, what I wanted to know is, were there side-to-side differences, but also were there differences between the age groups? Now, why is that interesting? Well, if our older players have these side-to-side differences, but our younger players don't, that may indicate that because the older players have been involved in this sport for a lot longer, these changes are due to having thrown for a long period of time. So that's why we're kind of looking at that difference. It also might give us an indication of, from a performance point of view, if our best international players look a certain way, is that something that we should be trying to get them to do because it helps with performance? I hope that kind of makes sense why we looked at that. So when we look at the literature out there, the first thing I'm going to talk about is shoulder rotation range of motion. And again, most of this work's been done in baseball, but we've had similar findings in handball, tennis, badminton, trying to think water polo as well to a degree. So this is quite common to all these throwing sports. I can't comment on javelin. I'm not aware of the javelin literature that well, to be honest. And what we commonly observe with all throwing athletes is they have this gain in external rotation range of motion. So if we look at the photos, the rotation on the right, you can see that one has 135 degrees of external rotation. So they can cock their arm a lot further back. Whereas the other one, which has 110 degrees, that would be the non-throwing side. Now, if you think about how important that external rotation at the shoulder is for the cocking position and throwing fast, it kind of makes sense that you would want that throwing shoulder to be able to get into that position. What we also observe, though, is that you have this deficit in internal rotation. So going the other way, you can't internally rotate your shoulder as far. So that's called internal rotation deficit, ERD or GERD. And generally, when you look at the literature, it'll be anywhere between 8 to 15 degrees of both external rotation gain and internal rotation deficit. And so what happens in the end is that they kind of cancel each other out. So if you add those ranges together, in this case, you get 180 degrees of external rotation on both sides. And that's pretty normal for throwing athletes across all these sports. Sometimes you can get a slight reduction in rotation on the throwing side, but generally, if you add how far they can rotate backwards into external rotation, how far they can rotate forwards into internal rotation, they're about the same. But what we didn't know is, was this the case in cricket? On the far left columns, we've got the blue line is external rotation in the throwing side. The orange one is external rotation in the non-throwing side. And the first column, which is 120 and 111, that's senior cricketers. The next one along is our adolescent cricketers. And you'll see that their ranges of motion are pretty similar, and they've both got a gain of external rotation of about 12 degrees. The gray column is the difference between the throwing side and the non-throwing side. Okay, so they've got 12 degrees more of external rotation on their throwing side. The columns on the right is rotating your shoulder the other way, internal rotation. And what we can see there is that our non-throwing shoulder has a lot more internal rotation than our throwing shoulder. And again, it's about 14 degrees. So that's pretty consistent with what we see in other throwing sports. And again, when you add the two together, they essentially cancel each other out. So that change in rotation, we've got that gain in rotation going backwards and that similar loss of rotation going forwards. So again, we can say that cricketers have a similar changes at the shoulder to other throwing sports. Why does this happen? So most people have talked about, so the anterior capsule of the shoulder, if that is tight, you get a restriction in shoulder external rotation. So the original concept is that anterior capsule becomes lax to allow that greater ranges of motion. And it's thought that that laxity in that anterior capsule makes throwers' shoulders unstable and makes them more at risk of getting pain with throwing. Internal rotation, and there's a mistake in this slide, it should be posterior capsule tightness. Posterior capsule tightness will restrict how far you can internally rotate your shoulder. And again, it was felt that posterior capsule tightness also contributed to throwing arm pain. But you can also get changes in the bone, which would account for these side-to-side differences. And that's changes in humeral retroversion, which I'm going to talk a bit more about now, which is only becoming more recognized. So before I move on to that, is everyone happy with that concept of you get this gain in external rotation, so you can cock your arm back further and you lose it that way, and that's common to throwers?
Is there also a difference in lateral thoracic spine flexion?
Possibly. Hasn't been measured as much because it's just harder to measure accurately.
Well, I mean, by anecdotal, like you happen to see a specific slant between the angle of the hips and the angle of the shoulders.
Oh yeah, you'll definitely get scolioses and changes in spinal position, definitely. Which again, I think I would assume is associated with rotation range of motion deficits in the thoracic spine. I think it hasn't been looked at as much, mainly because it's just harder to measure accurately. Yeah. And researchers tend to look at things which are easy to measure, if we're being honest.
Steve, could you, so say if this was the ball and socket joint here in the humerus, could you tell me where the anterior and posterior capsule would be with the laxity and tightness?
So anterior capsule's here.
Yeah.
So as I rotate back, that anterior capsule becomes stretched. If I have it like that, it'll become stretched.
Yeah.
And if it's really, really loose, I'll just be able to keep going further and further backwards. Okay. The other thing, if the anterior capsule becomes loose at the front, the ball is more easily able to slide forwards in the socket. So when you dislocate your shoulder, you're generally in that position. Someone hits you from behind and your shoulder pops forward, so you stretch your anterior capsule. That's the most common way. Or you're a rugby player and you fall like this, someone tackles you and forces your arm back and the slider pops forwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Posterior one is at the back, and as you internally rotate, it tightens up. Again, it's a bit hard to demonstrate when you're sitting in your kitchen. Take my word for it. Again, that's why people have become really interested in measure these ranges of motion, because there's this concept that it's associated with pain with throwing. But actually, more recently, a lot of the research is probably suggesting that these bony changes may account for what we see, rather than there being any changes in the joint capsule or that. So the next slide for me. So humeral torsion is basically what torsion means is twist. So the humerus is twisted. And what we find, so in this one, on the picture on the right, which is the middle picture of the shoulder, that's essentially the normal twist that you get in a humerus. So if so where that arrow pointing down is, that's the biceps groove. So that's the groove that your bicep sits in. And if that is in the uppermost position, the shoulder will tend to be slightly internally rotated. Everyone with me on that? Now, in humeral torsion, in that same position where the biceps tendon is in the uppermost position, the arm is actually more rotated externally. So there's this twist in the long axis. Everyone okay with that concept? So again, now what that essentially means is in the neutral position, people with that humeral retroversion are already slightly externally rotated, okay? So that's going to bias their movement to having more external rotation and less internal rotation. Again, that would account, so if you had a difference in the side-to-side twist at the shoulders, that could account for side-to-side differences in ranges of motion. At birth, our shoulders are retroverted, so we have more ranges of motion going back externally, okay? As we become active and we use more of our hands in front of us like this, muscle pull pulls that humerus more into that internally rotated position. Now you have a growth plate at the neck of the humerus, which is that kind of top circular arrow on the bottom diagram. That growth plate is open until between the ages of, well, it shuts at 12 years of age in girls and 14 years of age in boys, okay? So basically, up until that, by doing lots of activity in here like this, the bone grows into that twisted into internal rotation. Now, but what we find though, is that if you do throwing, you can halt this process, provided you've done a certain volume of throwing before your growth plate fuses, okay? Because you're always forcing your arm back into that cocking position as you throw, you maintain that twist in the humerus. Why is this relevant? So it's particularly relevant for us in cricket, where we've got a lot more women's cricketers now, and most of them take the game up at a later age, and they don't have this twist in their humerus. So as a consequence, they can't cock their arm back very far to throw, which means they're not very fast throwers because they're not adapted to it. And also, because they're not adapted to throwing, they're more likely to get injured. And we see that in our women's cricketers, the injury rates related to throwing are a lot higher. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor. So if we compare throwers to non-throwers, non-throwers' shoulders on both sides will look like a thrower's non-throwing side. It's a lot of throwing words there, but and when we look at swimmers, swimmers don't have this change either. Okay, so swimmers look like non-throwing athletes in terms of the twist in their humerus.
Yeah.
So this is a unique thing to throwing.
The word halts implies that it keeps going. Like
yeah. So basically, on the non-throwing side, we start off going backwards, and on a non-throwing side, it twists forwards.
Yeah.
Whereas on our throwing side, it just stays backward.
No, but I mean, like it says, the Erling throwing activity halts the process of plate fusing. So for how long?
Okay, sorry, that it doesn't halt the process of plate fusing. It halts the process of this twisting into internal rotation. Sorry for that being confusing.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, but what I mean is, so sorry for, thank you for, I should have asked a bit more detail about. So what that means is that once the growth plates fuses, that twisting is set fixed. Like you've got the rotation that you've got, you're not going to gain it later on. So again, this has been measured in a lot of sports. We then measured it in our cricketers. And so now with this one, the lower number means the humerus is more retroverted, okay? So it's getting the twist that we expect to see in throwers. And again, we saw a very similar thing where there was about an 11-degree difference in this humeral torsion between the throwing side and the non-throwing side, which pretty much matches up the changes in rotation that we get at the shoulder. Now, again, this is across the group overall, so these are averages, but what we're seeing is that actually this bony twist is probably more accounting for the changes that we're seeing rather than any changes in the shoulder capsule, be it either laxity or tightness. So I think the next question is, why does this happen? And the theory goes that it's likely to be a performance adaptation. So as I talked about earlier, the further you can cock your arm back, we know that's associated with throwing velocity. So is it something that, you know, helps actually with performance? Some people say it's a protective adaptation, where if I can get into that position because my bone is naturally grown into that position, it puts less stress on my ligaments and my capsules and my muscles. Now, we've done a little bit of work around that, and the indication for me is that it's a performance adaptation. It probably doesn't have a protective mechanism. But again, what we do know is that the people who don't have this, which is our women's cricketers, they don't perform very well. And because they're not adapted to throwing, they get a lot more shoulder pain as well. So when we look at shoulder rotation strength, again, this is commonly observed in all throwing sports. When we look at healthy throwers, they have greater internal rotation strength on their throwing side, which again makes sense because that correlates with throwing velocity. They have slightly increased external rotation strength. And again, remember the external rotators are the brakes at the shoulder. And as a consequence, they've got this increased internal external rotation ratio, okay? Now, a lot of the focus on injury risk in throwers has focused on this ratio. And basically what it says that if your internal rotators are really, really strong, but your external rotators are relatively weaker, you'll get this muscle imbalance, which puts you more at risk of getting shoulder pain.
Sorry, is this assuming concentrically or eccentrically strong?
Well, it's a very good point there, because this ratio has been measured lots of different ways, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. And so some have looked at it concentrically, some have looked at concentric to eccentric ratio, some have looked at eccentric to eccentric ratio. The literature's a bit murky, shall we say. And there's actually, the evidence to support this theory is not particularly strong when you look at it, if we're being honest. This is an assumption that's widely held. So again, I have to talk you through this. It's a bit easy to have a pointer, but again, on the far left column, we've got shoulder internal rotation strength. The first two columns are the senior cricketers, and the next one across are the adolescent cricketers. The blue one is in their dominant shoulder. The orange one is their non-dominant shoulder, and it's normalized to body mass. So because the older cricketers are heavier, we've kind of normalized it. And again, we see this similar pattern in both our senior and adolescent cricketers where, you know, the internal rotators are significantly stronger than the on the throwing side than the non-throwing side. We measured this using handheld dynamometry using a brake test, which is essentially an eccentric strength test. And again, we used a handheld dynamometer because it's quick, it's cheap, it's portable. So if I was traveling around the world in India or Bangladesh, I can take that handheld dynamometer with me and I can measure someone everywhere in the world. Whereas if you have an isokinetic dynamometer, which would be the gold standard, that's just not practical for field measurements. And then the columns on the right, again, we're looking at the external rotators. And generally what we're finding here is that if anything, there's a slight increase in strength on the dominant side, but really there's no, you know, it's pretty similar. There's not much difference. So again, the normal adaptation that we see around strength in throwers should be on that throwing side, that dominant side, that increase in internal rotation strength. When we look at scapulothoracic posture, it's normal in your throwers that they will be downwardly rotated, depressed, so down, drop down like that, protracted forwards and downwardly rotated. And again, you know, this is probably because we've got a shortened pectoralis minor and increased muscle bulk in our lats and our pecs. And again, if we think of the role that the lats and the pecs play as shoulder internal rotators, it's kind of not surprising if they're, you know, if they are hypertrophied and they're that much stronger, that's going to have an effect on that shoulder position. But even though they look asymmetrical, when and again, this is averages across a group, there's always going to be differences. When we look at people doing overhead activity, their scapula seems to move quite normally. Again, this is in the majority of healthy throwers. So even though it looks different at rest, it actually still functions okay. We also know from the research that the position that your shoulder blade has at rest is not related to whether or not you will get shoulder pain. And I think, again, there's a lot of assumptions that these asymmetries are related to pain, but when we look at the research, it doesn't exist. So again, did we see this in cricketers? So this is a quick way of measuring pec minor length. Again, if you've got changes in your thoracic spine, it will affect this test as well. So it's not just pec minor length. But in both our senior and junior cricketers, we did see this side-to-side difference. So again, the blue line is on the throwing side. The orange line is on the non-throwing side. And the amount of side-to-side difference is pretty similar, whether you're a senior cricketer or a adolescent cricketer.
Sorry, could you just explain that test? Because I couldn't quite work out what.
So basically, you measure the distance from the bed to that red dot, and that red dot is the posterior aspect of the acromion, which is the back of the scapula. Now, if you've got a tight pec minor will pull the shoulder forwards. Does that make sense? So the tighter the pec minor, the larger the distance from the bed to that point. But also, if you've got a scoliosis or a twist in your spine, that will also affect that position as well. Does that make sense? So it's not just pec minor. But effectively what it's saying is that in cricketers, much like other throwers, we do get these big side-to-side differences in shoulder blade position and scapular position. So the next one, we're looking at the position of the shoulder blade relative to the spine. So again, the greater the distance from A to B and D to E, the more that shoulder blade is coming forwards. So the more it's coming forwards, the higher that number will be. And again, we can see that in all those columns, that blue line, which is the throwing side, is much higher than the orange line, which is the non-throwing side. So again, we in our cricketers, whether they're seniors or adolescents, we get these side-to-side differences. I'm going to talk a little bit later on, and again, so why it's interested in these side-to-side differences is that these changes are kicking in at a young age, which you go, right, well, if it was just because of having done lots and lots of throwing, we'd expect these changes to be much greater in the older population, but we're getting them at a younger age, which may suggest that actually these changes are quite helpful for performance, rather than these asymmetries being something of concern related to injury. At the elbow, there's a lot less work done at the elbow on this. There's only a few studies in baseball. There's none really that I've found in any other throwing sports. And what we find in baseball is you get this increased carrying angle. So on this one, the forearm on the left, which is actually their right forearm, you can see that's more an acute angle on the red lines that I've had. Whereas on the right, that's more of a straighter angle. So increased carrying angle would be that more acute angle. And that's what we call elbow valgus. Now, if you can remember back from when I talked about the cocking position, elbow valgus will increase how far we can cock our arm back. So it kind of makes sense that on the throwing side, you'd have that valgus position at the elbow. What we also find in our throwers is, in particular baseballers, is that they get a reduction in elbow extension. So basically they can't straighten their elbow as much on their throwing side. So these are the changes that we see in baseballers. The columns with the smaller numbers looks at elbow extension. So basically, if I can fully straighten my elbow, that's 0, okay? And if I can go past it, that's 3 degrees past it. So I can actually go a long way past on my elbow. So again, what we see here is we do see some side-to-side differences, but they're really, really quite small in how far we can straighten our elbow. We're looking at 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, which is really negligible for that type of measure. When we look at the other one, which is the carrying angle. Again, we're looking at about a 4-degree difference, which is, when we look at the research, is it mightn't seem like much more, but it's probably just large enough to be actually meaningful. And again, these changes are happening in senior and adolescent cricketers. There's, so that indicates that these changes are happening at a young age. So I think the question with the elbow is why, and there's been far less work done on this. Again, if we get bony changes up at the shoulder joint related to throwing, it probably stands to reasons that we can probably get bony changes at the elbow joint as well as an adaptation to throwing, but we don't know that. It's also possible that changes in the soft tissue, such as, so the ligament on the inside of the elbow is the one that stops it being taken out to the side. So if that ligament is lax, maybe you've got that increased carrying angle. It's also possible if you've got tightness or contracture in the capsule at the front of the elbow, that might stop you from straightening so much. But again, we don't know as much about that at the elbow. So again, the big question with this is it a performance adaptation or is it related to pain? The answer is we don't know. I think the carrying angle, that increased carrying angle, is probably a performance adaptation, because again, it allows you to get into that greater cocking position to throw. Whereas I think the loss of elbow extension, because we haven't seen that as much in our cricket, is probably more of a maladaptation. So if you've got changes in the elbow joints, you've got osteophytes, which is bone growth, you won't be able to straighten your elbow. And I think that is probably more related to elbow pain. So that's kind of the summary of the research. What I haven't showed in this is that I've compared our cricketers to soccer players, and I matched our cricketers to soccer players. And again, in our soccer players, we didn't see these differences, which makes me think that, okay, this is related to throwing activity, whereas soccer players don't use their upper limbs at all. Cricketers, in cricket, for you guys from the States, there are 4 different positions. They all have different roles, but they all throw. And what we found is that there were no differences between positions. So the common activity that they all do is throwing, which makes us think that these changes are due to throwing rather than something else in cricket. And when we looked at our women's cricketers, who generally have come to the sport late, because it's only a sport that's become really popular fairly recently, they don't have these same changes, And so again, we don't know for a fact, but if they didn't participate a lot in throwing sports when they're at these younger ages, did they not get these changes that you need in order to be able to become a good thrower? If we go to the final one, which is kind of the summary, and I'm conscious I've probably gone way over time, but we started a bit late. So I think the big thing for me is side-to-side differences in throwers are normal, and you probably need to have these differences to actually be a good thrower. And again, this is in the sports that I'm familiar with, which is your baseball and your cricketers. The fact that there are very few differences between senior and adolescent cricketers suggests that these changes happen at a younger age. And as I said, they're probably related to performance and in some cases maybe related to injury. And how I use this in my role in cricket is that it's quite well recognized these days that kids are less active than they were, a generation ago when they're younger. They're probably playing less incidental sport. Certainly, they might not be doing general physical activity or specific throwing activity. Throwing in cricket is something that isn't as important as some of the other skills, so they don't do it so much. And what I've really tried to encourage them is to, when they're young, get them throwing regularly and consistently to try to get these adaptations to the shoulder, because if they then make it to an England level, they've at least got some of the things that we would like to see that will enable them to perform properly as a thrower with regards to velocity and be able to handle it.
Relating to cricket, Steve, despite the way I sound, I'm actually English, but all 4 positions, all throw. In the research that you did you notice any difference with the figures for bowlers who have a different action when they're bowling? And this is subjective, but when I've watched cricket matches, it seems that bowlers, when they're fielding, will often sidearm throw it back, I'm assuming to protect their shoulder in some way.
So when I answer your question, the differences we found between the positions weren't related to these measures that I took. We found other differences, but not related to these measures. So fast bowlers were taller because with fast bowling, the longer levers you've got, the easier it is to generate pace. And they were more powerful on our lower limb trunk measures because, again, fast bowling is quite a powerful action. Our spin bowlers were heavier, they were fatter, which, again, if you know cricket, the physical demands on them is far less than the other positions. And then when we looked at some physical performance measures such as aerobic fitness and speed, again, there were differences between our fast bowlers and our slow bowlers and our batsmen, with the fast bowlers generally more powerful and had better aerobic conditioning. But when we looked at these measures, we didn't see that many differences at all. In terms of why they sidearm, I've got a few thoughts on that. If you've got a sore shoulder, if you throw with a sidearm, the stress becomes less on the shoulder. Now, what we found interestingly enough, when I looked at the study on pain, a history of shoulder pain is a risk factor for developing elbow pain, but not vice versa. And so I think if you've got a sore shoulder, you then drop your elbow to sidearm it in, which then puts more pressure on the elbow. I think that's why they do that. The other thing too is throwing technique in cricket is not something that is drilled into cricketers. There's an assumption from a lot of cricket coaches, and I'll put my Australian hat on here, a lot of English cricket coaches, that people just know how to throw, and they don't. And again, if you go to America, there's lots of drills around throwing technique in baseball. Cricket in Australia, fieldings have had a higher emphasis historically than in the UK. I think it's just they've just been allowed to adopt this throwing technique from a young age. That would be my take on it.
Could you give a little more detail on the parameters of how you tested the eccentric capacity with the dynamometer?
Yeah, I'll turn side on. So, well, first thing to your question, the gold standard was the isokinetic dynamometer. But to do an isometric measure, it takes half an hour per subject. Now, I got given by our coaches 20 minutes with each player. So I had to get whatever tests I could get done in 20 minutes. And when you're trying to get through 160 players over multiple days, you got to go with what's practical in the field. Now, there's a number of different ways you can measure it using a dynamometer, but basically, sitting position, sorry, I'll slink down, shoulder in modified neutral, so 90 degrees abduction here. One person holding under their elbow and one person holding their spine to make sure they weren't rotating. We place the dynamometer here, and with their other hand, they're allowed to brace so they're stable.
Okay.
And basically you say, I'm going to slowly build the pressure and I'm going to try to move your hand. I want you to resist me and try not to let me move you. So we don't want them to push into me. We just want them to hold still. And I build up the pressure, build up the pressure, build up the pressure.
Over how many seconds?
Over 5 seconds.
Okay, so it stays within the ATP system then.
Yeah. And basically, when they can no longer hold it, that's a measure of eccentric strength. The other way you can do that test...
Wouldn't that be a failure of isometric strength right there, where yielding isometric becomes eccentric lengthening?
Well, possibly. I mean, again, I think from my point of view, the reason I chose it is that it's quick and easy to use in the field and it's reliable. There are other ways of measuring it in other positions which aren't as reliable. The other way you can do it is where you say, right, push into me as hard as you can. So they push into you. Now, what we found when they did that was they adopt all other strategies. They'll start to twist, they'll flex their elbows, they cheat. So that's why we've gone for you stay still, I'll put you in this position, you stay still, don't let me move you, don't let me move you, don't let me move you. And as soon as they give, you stop. And then for internal, it's the other way, pushing up, don't let me move you, don't let me move you, don't let me move you, stop. We did another one, which is the full can position, which is where they're up here like this. You put the dynamometer there, which I didn't talk about. And again, that's how we measured it. There's a lot more devices coming out on the market now. I mean, Valve Performance have like the Force Frame, and there's Kangatech and things like that where you can measure them, where you've got the device is fixed. But again, they're expensive, they're not portable, and in cricket when you spend so much. Sorry?
It's not practical.
No, in cricket when you spend so much time traveling, it's just not feasible. And the thing about a handheld dynamometer, I would also use it for some hip test measures as well. So I like it.
Earlier, you referred to 3 specific phases of throwing, which was cocking, acceleration, and deceleration.
Yeah.
Where in cocking and deceleration, most injuries would occur, you said?
Yeah.
Because of the peak eccentric stresses?
Yeah. So it's the type of injuries that you get in the deceleration phase are different to the ones that you get in the cocking acceleration phase. But basically, late cocking, early acceleration, the stresses are similar. They get certain types of injuries at both the shoulder and elbow. And in the deceleration phase, you get different types of injuries. So now, when the movement happens so quickly, how do they tell where they get hurt? Because if they're moving at 7,000 degrees, how do they know it was at this phase when I got hurt? Well, if you get pain in the cocking phase, pain inhibition will stop you from rotating quickly. So they'll throw, but their power will be nowhere.
Yeah.
If you get pain in the deceleration phase, you can still throw flat out, but because you struggle to put the brakes on, it hurts after. So basically, the ones who can still maintain their speed, they've got a problem with the deceleration phase.
So you mentioned you mentioned that the scapula would be farther laterally from the spine in throwers versus non-throwers. So that would indicate there's a eccentric component at rest. So there would be developmentally an eccentric component to pull that, like the inertia of the arm pulling on the scapula, pulling on the fibers attaching to the thoracic spine. When releasing, that deceleration would have then the scapular adaptation too, right? Because you're measuring the humerus individual from the scapula, but do you also do measurements from the scapula?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to answer your question. I might get it wrong. So pec minor, which protracts the shoulder. So if it's tight, it will pull the shoulder into protraction and more laterally, right? Now, when we accelerating, our scapula protracts quite powerfully because it's one way we increase velocity. So again, if that muscle becomes hypertrophy, then that could pull it forwards.
Yeah.
And also if we haven't developed the braking strength in our scapular retractors, they mightn't be able to counterbalance that. So you can get this mismatch between strength in the scapular protractors and weakness in the scapular retractors. I didn't measure that because it's harder to measure it.
That would be then what measure of weakness? Like, are you talking about concentric strength, isometric, eccentric? And do the velocity conditions matter when measuring either concentrically or eccentrically with this joint?
Well, the short answer is, yeah, they do. The challenge is measuring scapular retractors strength, basically, because it's very hard to measure objectively. So the way that it's often measured, it's in prone in a YT position. So you're in prone, you're out in a T or a Y.
Yeah.
You're asked to lift your hand up, which is going to be a bit of scapular retraction, but also shoulder horizontal extension,
yeah,
and you put the handheld dynamometer through the wrist. Now, if someone fails, have they failed because of the shoulder?
But that's the short muscle length then, right? So
exactly.
Then you have the sliding filament problem where you have them overlapping. What do you call that? Active insufficiency? No, not active insufficiency. I lost the name, but you know what I'm talking about,
yeah.
right?
The reason it's measured there is because it's reliable. in other positions, the measure's not as reliable. So that it basically becomes a problem with actually how do you measure that? You know, I think it's important. Can we measure it? Probably not. Doesn't matter if we can't measure it.
All right, last one. I won't take too much of your time because I can keep going, right? Why did you choose the neutral angle to measure with the dynamometer versus a large angle or a shorter angle?
So if you take them to end of range, for a lot of them, it's uncomfortable. And because it's uncomfortable, they won't give you a proper maximum strength. It's harder to standardize the position across people because some people won't actually let you get into their true end of range. They'll kind of fight you there. And so that position is actually more easier to standardize. We looked at a number of different positions and I played around with it and it was reliable. And there was a researcher in the States at the Mayo Clinic called Wendy Hurd who'd done a lot of work in baseball. And that was a position that she used.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, well, you know, if it's good enough for her and I want to compare cricketers to baseball, it kind of makes sense.
Because I was wondering about the torsional twist. Like if there's differences in torsional twist, then the standardized position of the same angle of the forearm won't be technically the same angle of the shoulder.
Agreed. So, no, you're completely right.
That colors the results as well.
And that's why there's what I do in research and what I do as a clinician. Does that make sense? So for research, where you have to meet certain standards in terms of reliability and validity and consistency, that's the best way to measure it. When you're a clinician and you're more trying to solve a clinical problem, it's not important how accurate this number is. So as a clinician, I would test them out in that position. I just wouldn't try to measure it.
Fair enough.
And because, you know, not everything that's measurable is worth measuring.
Yeah.
And not everything that's worth measuring can be measured. You know, so I don't, that's something that people throw at me a lot. Well, why did you do it that way? And why didn't you measure this? And it's like, it's not that I don't think it's important. It's just I haven't found a test that I can use that's an accurate way of measuring it.
Fair enough. Well,
and in terms of rehab, I would definitely, you know, in terms of that deceleration phase, I love rowing variations where they really reach into full protraction and they get that coordinated pattern. Unilateral ones where they can rotate, you know, these, you know, basically working it through that range. And that's why I like for that particular, you know, to try to get that going rather than an isolated scapular retraction in a range.
Fair enough. Cool. Thanks for your patience and your time.
No. It's much easier in person to demonstrate and do stuff than this, but hopefully you got something out of it.
Definitely.
Steve, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and congrats on your research. That's really good. What year did you release your research?
It's under embargo. So ECB basically competitive advantage. So any research done in England cricket gets under embargo for 5 years before we publish it, because the theory is that the competitors, that is Australia, will take it and learn from it. And the Australians do that. So there's lots of biomechanics work that we've done in fast bowling, which hasn't been published, but we promote it with the coaches and promote it with the practitioners. And my personal take on it is, just because it's been published doesn't mean that someone will know how to use it and incorporate it into their context and their environment. You know, so I don't see any issue with sharing it. And also, you've still got to be able to apply it to the athlete and get the result. Knowing something is one thing, but getting the outcome is a very different thing in the real world.
Yeah. So in my javelin throwers, I always measure external rotation and internal rotation. And typically the better throwers tend to be around 115 plus to about 130. External. Internal rotation, typically 50 to 60. So you mentioned, I had no idea that internal rotation strength was correlated to velocity. Could you, where is the peak force in that range?
Well, again, they've measured it all doing similar things. And when I say correlated to velocity, they're moderate correlations. And again, it will depend, lots of things are correlated with velocity. So I know the baseball literature and the cricket literature best of all, so I'm going to stick with that if that's okay. So counter movement jump is correlated with velocity. Grip strength is correlated with velocity. Isometric mid-thigh pull is correlated with velocity. A lateral leap is correlated with velocity. A med ball side rotation throw is correlated with velocity. Basically, as you know, power gets generated in the legs, gets transferred up through the trunk to the shoulder. And so if you're able to generate more power in the legs, that would make sense why counter movement jump, lateral leap, isometric mid-thigh pull are correlated with velocity. The medicine ball side throw is proposed as a test which looks at trunk rotation power. So again, if you're thinking that funneling of that power from the legs to the trunk, that kind of makes sense. And then, the final thing, that shoulder internal rotation, is that kind of last link. So what we know from our I'll speak to our fast bowling research, and fast bowling is quite similar to javelin, is that all the fastest fast bowlers in the world do 5 things similarly. Some of them, because of their own unique constraints and technique, do some of those things more than others, but they all do them. So I think with throwing, all those things are probably important for throwing velocity, but based on your own individual makeup, some things are probably more important for you than others. So, if someone's got adequate upper body strength, whatever adequate is, and I'm not sure what that is, but when you look at their lower limb power and their trunk power, they're down. Okay, well, maybe, I know the research says that this is correlated with throwing velocity, but actually, from what we understand about biomechanics, this is where I need to focus. So, yeah, what I wouldn't want people to do would be to just hear that and then just do shoulder internal rotation strength. Because again, for me, what we also know is that if you aren't very effective at generating power from your legs and your trunk, you will then overload your upper limb, and that's when you're more likely to get shoulder and elbow problems. So I actually, so for me, it's the research says this, but let's take a step back. Let's look at the biomechanics of the whole thing, and then let's look at this cricketer we have in front of us and say, right, knowing what's normal for a cricketer, you're in our bottom quartile on this measure. That probably needs to be a priority. So they'll all get a strength test. They'll all get a strength exercise in all those areas. But actually for you, because you're really poor in lower limb power, we're going to have a bit more of a focused attention on that. We also get some guys who, when you measure their strength is brilliant, but they still throw slowly. And that's because they actually haven't been able to, they don't have the coordination to be able to integrate it into their throwing action. So again, it's not one or the other, it's kind of all of them. So we'd do a needs assessment on, right, what's your throwing velocity? where are you on all these measures, and what do we need to do unique to you? And that's why I said, so someone might read the research and go, oh, okay, this is correlated with throwing velocity, and all of a sudden the only exercise they're doing is shoulder internal rotation strengthening, when actually that's not how throwing works. Javelin throwers are, far better than cricketers in generating force from the ground and transferring it to the upper limb. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, Brill, thank you. Do you see what ratio do you see between internal and external
in strength?
Yeah.
So from the measures that I've used, we get about 1.3, with a range of probably about 1.2 to 1.4. That's kind of the range. And when we personally did find some relationship between higher ratios and developing shoulder pain. So when it got above 1.5 to 1.6 to 1.7, they did get shoulder pain. But then when we looked at the components, it was always because their external rotators were weaker. So basically, it was never because their internal rotators were so much stronger than our normal ranges. It was always their external rotators were weaker. And those people who had those ratios and got pain, their external rotation strength on their throwing side was less than their non-throwing side. And from the data that we have, that shouldn't be the case. So yeah, that's how I interpreted those ratios.
Wow, yeah. I've got one jav thrower who I'd say her elbow extension is about, it ranges between about 165 to 175.
Yeah.
And over time, I mean, I've known her for about 5 years, and it's gone from straight to, here. And literally what you were saying, that is a normal adaptation of throwing.
Maybe. Depends how big it is. So if you come back to this Goldilocks zone, so what we found is that most of our cricketers, I'll speak to the shoulder because I know more about that. Most of our cricketers, their loss of internal rotation was around about the 15-degree mark, okay? Now, the ones who didn't have that, they didn't throw very well and they were more likely to get hurt. And and this is our women's cricketers, my interpretation of that is they weren't adapted to throwing, okay? When we looked at our men's population, if you'd lost more than 25 degrees of internal rotation, so a lot more than the normal range, you were likely to get pain with throwing. And basically, you've adapted so much, your body's changed so much into throwing, it's now become maladapted, for want of a better word. So there's this kind of, I interpret it as, there's this kind of like, this zone here is normal changes related to throwing. If you haven't changed, that's bad, because you're not adapted to throwing, you won't perform well and you put yourself more at stress. If you've changed more than this normal zone, that's an indication that something's going on that's not quite right and you're probably more at risk. So when I look at the elbow, I would consider a normal loss of extension to be about 5 degrees. If it's more than that, that for me is, okay, this is no longer in our normal range. The other thing too that you noticed from the numbers is they didn't change between the adolescents and the seniors. And there's a few cricketers we were able to follow up over several years, and they really didn't change over several years, most on average. And so if someone's lost range of motion and over time they lose more and more and more and more and more and more, I would probably interpret that as something's going on there that's probably not a normal change. That doesn't mean they will get hurt, but that tells me that something's going on there that's probably not a normal change anymore, because as I said, from my numbers, these changes are happening, when they're in their teens, basically.
So is that 11 to 15 degree change over a couple of years then, when
at the shoulder?
Yeah.
I don't know when it happens because I haven't measured people young enough. So when they look at little leaguers in baseball, these changes are happening at 8 to 10 years of age in their pitches. So these changes are happening really, really early. And the only way you could know for a fact if these changes are related to throwing, that study is impossible to do because you'd have to take about 500 kids, you'd have to measure them every single year, you'd have to record what activities they've done, and you'd have to follow them up from the ages of 6 to about 18. So it's impossible. So the only way we can figure out if these changes are related to throwing are like the things that I've done where we compare throwers to non-throwers, throwers across different ages, those type of things, to see if differences occur. But I would imagine that if you were able to do that study, you would see that the kids who did throwing sports and did throwing sports to a certain volume, probably between 8 and 14, they're going to start to get these side-to-side differences that the other kids don't, I would imagine. Because we did have a couple of footballers. Now, most footballers had no side-to-side differences. But some of these footballers had actually played cricket and tennis when they were younger. So they looked more like throwers than the rest of the footballing group. Yeah. Now, I would argue that's because they did those sports when they were younger, but I don't know that for a fact.
And then just finally, anecdotally, when I went to Finland, which is the javelin capital of the world, kids throw literally from the age of like 5, 6 in just little groups on the field. One's throwing, one's catching, one's a man or woman, and their ranges of motion are absolutely insane when they get to senior compared to us British. They're struggling. British people are probably struggling to get 110, 115. Finnish, they're 140. It's insane.
Yeah.
And they're doing it. It's as popular as football is in the UK. Javelin is in the young Finnish people. It's crazy.
Yeah, and again, if you were to, if we were to do cross cultures and cross studies, I would imagine you'd see these differences between, because again, if you were to compare, a sport which has, a country which has a culture of a throwing sport to a non-country, I would imagine you'd see these differences, which would be accountable to that. And again, how did so if we had a cricketer who wasn't adapted to throwing, the way I would do that with our coaches is I would say, look, this information here tells me they're not adapted to throwing. We need to consider how we adapt their fielding training session on this basis. So do we avoid certain throws? Do we give them more rest periods? Do we actually spend more time developing the physical qualities to throw? So again, if you looked at your, so if someone came to javelin late, do you actually say, right, because you're not adapted to throwing, you've probably only got X number of throws in you before you break. Do we actually spend more time working on these other qualities that may transfer better to save your, shoulder, elbow? Again, these are kind of the work that I wanted to do that I would love to be able to do at Loughborough would be to get all the throwing. So I've just compared cricketers, and I'm assuming that all throwers look the same. But I'd love to get all the throwing sports in Loughborough and do a similar study and go, right, are they all similar? Are they different? Who goes on to get hurt? Who doesn't? What are the factors to do it? And that's something that I've tried to kind of, pitch to Kingy as something we consider. Do we get all the tennis, badminton squad athletes, all the cricketers, and because the study that I did is pretty simple. At the start of pre-season, I take all these measures, and then you just sit back and watch, and you see, who goes on and performs, who doesn't go on and perform, and then at the end of 2-3 years, you then go, right, how are they different up front? Not very helpful for a coach who has to make, try to decisions about performance and keeping them healthy. But, what we were able to do is we were able to give our cricket coaches some really good information about, performance and minimizing the risk of injury. There have been some. The one that I'm most familiar with is it looks at the proportion of kids who go on to play Major League Baseball and whether they're based in the north or the south of the US. And actually more of them come from the north of the US, with the concept being that from the south, because you can play baseball for longer periods of time, they either get injured or they get burnt out, basically, or they specialize early in that sport and they don't play these other sports. There's some work done around that. I know there has been done some studies which have compared them, but I just can't remember that well, I'm afraid. But yeah, I definitely know that there are differences in the States, related to baseball, where based on your location. The thing that we don't know is we don't know how much. So, what's the minimum effective dose? So is it enough to throw for 6 months of the year? Is it enough to throw 3 times a week? Is it, do you just need to be doing 20 throws a session? How hard? We don't know, is the honest answer. But for me, the biggest concern for me is, so what the pattern that happened in cricket was, in England anyway, was over the winter when we're indoors, we just work on our batting and bowling skills. We don't do fielding because we don't have the space. So they wouldn't throw for 4 or 5 months of the year. Now, when we were doing England under-19 tours, we would take them away for a tour in December and January and February. Now, they hadn't done any throwing for about 3-4 months before those tours. And funnily enough, what happens when you go outside is they break and they can't throw. So I was like, so what I said to them is, I said, look, please, 3 times a week, just do 20 throws into a wall, like just enough to just keep things ticking over. That's all I want you to do. And there's no excuse for why they couldn't do that in training. And that was my sports medicine preventative intervention, because it just kept them topped up. Because again, what would happen would be, they're aware that we can't bowl every day because otherwise our bowlers will get stress fractures and break down. So what do they do instead? I will do fielding. So now all of a sudden we're doing fielding every day and throwing every day because we can't bowl all the time, and all the shoulders and elbows break down. And so, it seems so obvious, but actually so hard to actually just change a culture of, hey, you know what? When you're waiting to go into the nets indoors, just pick a ball up and throw it into a net 20 times. Or, hey guys, when we go outside overseas on tours, look, we can do fielding every day, but let's just not throw every day. We can work on our catching and work on our ground fielding, but or if we're going to throw, let's bring the volume down significantly and do it consistently. By the end of my time there, we had set tour protocols for, how we wanted to operate. So we had to get 1 strength session in a week, 1 speed session in a week to maintain it. We would have, we would field X number of days a week and bowl X number of days a week. And if you weren't playing, you had to do top-ups from a fitness point of view, which, I know that's the culture in a lot of other sports, but in cricket, that's, not a culture. And again, it's just basic, but it's when you've got a sport which has a culture of how it is, it can be hard to change sometimes.